Hi friends, my name is host Eric. I'm the host of Talking with Famous People. I'm going to attempt a video now that I've been thinking about making for a while, which I think is very needed and maybe revelatory about the power and utility of cognitive functions. So, one of the weird things about them is that to an even greater extent than is the case with existing kinds of debate taxonomies, everything in the world, every kind of argumentation, every kind of claim, every kind of communicative event of any sort. In other words, anything that people do that leaves a record of itself, that has some kind of finalia that occurs, as a consequence of it. Namely, anything that we record or talk about in a public fashion, etc., can successfully be understood through one of these frames of reference that are the 8 cognitive function references. In other words, this list is both comprehensive, it's comprehensive. It's both necessary and sufficient to explain everything, and that's what makes it the meta frame. No matter what you talk about, you can link it back to cognitive functions successfully without straining it. Now, let's talk about kinds of frames of reference that it's different than saying, I can put anything through this lens, right? So I could evaluate every single thing on this Google News page through the lens of class and income inequality or something. In other words, everything in the world can be linked to my pet thing if I want to, right? The thing here is that doesn't make something the meta frame, because in that instance you're not that's taking a frame, taking things underneath your frame and applying them to your frame. What I'm doing here is saying, let's analyze how everybody else is doing that. Now, if you try to analyze how everybody else is doing that in other capacities, then you only get part of the explanation. So in debate, we might analyze certain kinds of arguments as working like this or like that, but it doesn't tell us anything about the arguer necessarily, because of one of the implicit frames that is the number one implicit frame in debate, which is relative absolutism, which is to say things are absolute relative to your definitions, and it's a binary way of processing things that links to introverted thinking. So each of these things here links to a cognitive function. Number 1, singularity is Ni. 2, originality is Ne. 3, harm prevention remediation is Fi. Number 4, representationalism is Fe. Number 5, relative absolutism is Ti. Absolute relativism is Te. Reliability is Si, and execution is Se. Okay, so let's look here. Just to give a quick rundown with some of these things here. I'll probably edit this video ultimately, but let's look at these headlines. Texas MIT failed shooting response. Delay in breaching classroom was wrong decision. So in this instance, they're saying what's being argued here is specifically execution 8. The thing is, this little table here is not a comprehensive explanation of how each of these 8 things plays out. And in this instance, it plays out as hesitation was the problem. That we had the opportunity to succeed in this, but we failed to take action when we needed to, and that's what's to blame. And this post-mortem analysis of how to blame is essentially an absolute relativist frame. It says, we always look to empirics for a more efficient course against outcomes in the status quo, or against outcomes in the past against our ideal, right? So hindsight is maybe 20/20, but figuring out what went wrong so we don't repeat that mistake is a combination of SI and TE. And it itself presumes a SI kind of frame of reference, that you're not going to be surprised by new realities that this lesson that you've learned don't apply to. It ignores the fact that some things you ought not probably generalize from. The fact that the police chose not to bust in and potentially start a firefight is partly what they were thinking, was not necessarily the wrong decision, even though it didn't turn out right. It didn't turn out well, right? Now, it's easy to say that anything that doesn't turn out well is a bad decision, but that's going to be another SE kind of frame of reference that's saying, well, the only thing that really matters are the impacts. And so you can see that everything starts collapsing into this really easily and straightforward. No, the Albany school shooting wasn't a false flag. This is a relative absolutism kind of critique. It's saying there may be a desire among people to believe this, and that desire is going to come from NI, singularity, bad NI plus FI, harm prevention remediation. People like singular explanations to feel as though that which is precious to them can be predictably protected because they have a clear, understood bad guy. When random bad shit happens, people are desperate to find some NI explanation and or some TE problem in order to prevent it from occurring again, because none of us like surprises, and that's the prime directive. That's the other element of cognitive functions when understood correctly, is that it all can be translated into and out back from the prime directive in an effort to prevent surprises. So now let's go down here. Forest Service says it started all of New Mexico's largest wildfire. Cap Canyon fire was caused by a dormant pile burn that happened in January. Okay, so in this instance, what's going to be argued here is a originality frame of reference with a relative absolutist frame of reference. We can anticipate what might go wrong. We should have discussed this more, and if we had analyzed what might go wrong and the potential benefits and harms of this course of action that we were prescribing, maybe we wouldn't have done it. So it's the opposite of execution. It's the negation of execution. It's saying by taking action we caused harms when no action would have caused no harms. Okay. And again, it's a singularity frame that everybody wants to collapse things down ultimately into. The NI is the way in which people truly understand things. So we get a bunch of details about something, and until it has an identity, namely a point, nothing is ever understood per se. Alright, so as we scroll down here, you see these sad things about this, these sad personal stories to make you feel, in a sense, the person is expressing harm prevention as a frame of reference. They're saying, by attending to how bad these harms actually are, then it presumably pushes us towards further affirmations of something. And you can see this NI need to blame. If you look over here on the right, I'll have to make this go over there, but it shows this title, from Sandy Hook to Buffalo and Uvalde, 10 years of failure on gun control. So, I mean, this is really poisoning the well, right? They're presuming the singular explanation that they want to be the case. Their affirmation is, we ought to have more gun control, that too many guns in America is responsible for all the gun violence, and then they're projecting that frame as though it were not a point in dispute in the title of their article. It's a really fucking ugly thing to do, in my opinion. It's really ugly, but whatever. So let's scroll down here and look at some other kinds of things. And this one as well, long COVID symptoms and treatment, what we know so far. This is another example of the same thing. Whether or not this long COVID, as it's known, is actually a thing, or whether it's just, where is it? Oh, it's over on the side over here. Or whether it's, I mean, because the thing is, there are so many purported symptoms of this long COVID, and some of them disconnected symptomatically and in time by a long distance from actually having had COVID, that the linkage is not at all resolved, okay? So it's definitely in dispute. But here goes the New York Times pretending as though it's not in dispute, you know? Okay, now let's scroll down here. With public camping a felony, Tennessee homeless seek refuge. So this is a careful way of projecting a frame, right? It's like, it is the case that public camping is a felony in Tennessee, I guess. And it is the case that, therefore, people who don't have homes seek a refuge someplace. But there's an implied linkage there, right? That says that the reason these poor people are suffering is because of this bad law. They're not saying that explicitly, but it's an appeal to harm prevention or remediation. Max Carpenter signs major league deal with New York Yankees. This is simply like a basic 7-8 reliability execution. We can reliably anticipate this player to play for the team next year because this action was taken. And documents shed light on secret U.S. plans for apocalyptic scenarios. So, in this instance, it's reporting on existing archival stuff. This is an appeal to SI, really, 7, saying there's archival data, there's data in the archives that we could have, information that we could utilize ourselves to make decisions about things that we don't have access to. And it's also an appeal to representationalism, therefore. It's saying data ought to be objective. And whether or not you're and this is why it's important we just use terms correctly and distinguish between how, data can be objective if and when, and in any instance in which that data is equally accessible to all third parties. Secrecy is a way of bypassing the availability of objective data to all third parties. It doesn't render the data subjective. It instead attempts to monopolize its objective accessibility. Okay, so if we look here, physicists trace the rise of entropy to quantum information. So now this is an interesting title. This is the sort of thing I always click on. The second law of thermodynamics is among the most sacred in science, but it's always rested on 19th century arguments about probability. New arguments trace its true source to the flows of quantum information. In all of physical law, there's arguably no principle more sacrosanct than the second law of thermodynamics, the notion that entropy, a measure of disorder, will always stay the same or increase. If someone points out to you your pet theory of the universe is a disagreement with Maxwell's equations, then so much the worse for Maxwell's equations. If it is to be found to be contradicted by observation, well, these experimentalists do bungle things sometimes. But if your theory is found to be against the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There is nothing for it but to collapse in deepest humiliation. No violation of this law has ever been observed, nor is it any expected. Well, this is really interesting. So the thing is about entropy and the measure of disorder. Well, let's see what it says here. Something about the second law troubles physicists. Some are not convinced we understand it properly or that its foundations are firm. Although it's called a law, it's usually regarded as merely probabilistic. It stipulates the outcome of any process will be the most probable one, which effectively means the outcome is inevitable given the numbers involved. Yet physicists just don't want descriptions of what will probably happen. We like physics to be exact. A number of independent groups appear to have done just that. They may have woven the second law of the fundamental principles of quantum mechanics, which some suspect have directionality and irreversibility built into them at the deepest level. According to this view, the second law comes about not because of classical probability, but because of quantum effects such as entanglement, and arises from the ways in which quantum systems share information, and from the cornerstone quantum principles that decree what is allowed to happen and what is not. In this telling, an increase in entropy is not just the most likely outcome of change, it is a logical consequence of the most fundamental resource that we know of, the quantum resource of information. Okay, so you get all these fancy words and stuff, but what what's underlying them all is the thing that I've been saying for a long time, and that can be difficult for people to understand because it seems to run counter to how we experience the world. So we experience the world as there are real things in the world that we bump into, right? And so it's hard for us to understand that reality is observer first. After all, I could not see something and still bump into it, right? In fact, I could be looking back behind me and run straight into, and talking to Joe, and run straight into a light pole. And in that case, obviously it existed before I observed it. But the problem there is the term observe. So that we exist in a rendered reality that seems independent of our own, namely the physical world, is not within any dispute. You can't dispute that it at least seems that way, right? The point is, there's no event without both the light pole and the observer. The guy who's run into the light pole and hurt himself, without that event occurring, there's nothing to talk about. The light pole might still exist, but it's not part of any reality that ever gets discussed, because reality is only manifest in any kind of way that can be communicated, observer first. So what this is saying is that the reason entropy occurs, which is to say things don't stay in stasis forever, is because information occurs. And information is the rendering of the other half of reality. Those physical objects are insufficient to comprise a reality in and of themselves. They need to have an engagement with an observer for reality to turn on. Without observation or engagement by an agent who's conscious in some sense, then there's nothing to be discussed, right? So the problem is, of course, it doesn't generally suit a human being's interests to think about things that way. And in fact, it's incredibly difficult to think about things that way correctly without falling into this manifesting kind of shit, To think about it correctly is to say that both sides of reality exist, and they don't form reality until they come together. Namely, the physical, the biological, and the metaphysical, that is to say, observation and the process of paying attention. Reality construction is one that is done via the paying of attention by individuals. So, okay, let's continue what I'm doing here for a little bit longer, and then I'm going to wrap this up. Arming teachers is hard, even in gun-loving Texas. Okay, so in this instance, there's a debate, I guess, in Texas about whether teachers should be armed to prevent this sort of thing from occurring again. Now, again, this is a very T-I-S-I-F-I kind of thing. Whoever wrote this, by calling Texas gun-loving, it's suggestive that there's a dismissive quality to what they're saying there, which is what's implied by what they're saying is an appeal to a representationalist consensus that you don't really need guns, and also to a representationalist kind of harm prevention remediation sense that if you guys didn't have so many guns over there wouldn't have been this thing happen, right? Both those things are implied, but neither of them are stated directly, and yet it's pretty clear where the writer's biases lie. And that's the thing to remember here, is that every single one of these titles and every one of these articles was written by somebody and reflects that individual's bias. So let's look, for example, at this. Loki director responds to Russell T. Debbie's criticism of bisexual reveal. Okay. It's not clear what's going to be said there. This is a very informational title. This is a very flat title, right? It's not clear what's going to end up being inside of that article. You have to look at it to find out. Help! The airline changed my flight itinerary for the worse. Okay, so this is an appeal to relative absolutism, basically, which is to say, hey, you said meow, and now you've changed my thing. It's also an appeal to representationalism. Most people hopefully will agree with me that that's not fair, and will. It's also an appeal to absolute relativism. Now, can somebody tell me what to do to fix this problem? So there's an assumption then that we're all in agreement that this is bad. The singularity that overarches everything here is that it's not okay for airlines to do this. This is an interesting headline. Rosemead High School closes after vague threat about Rosemead High School, officials say. So, is the article kind of implying that maybe the school overreacted? Maybe. LA County workers reach agreement on strikes, avoid agreement on raises, avoid strike. So that's framing this as basically a good thing. Like, okay, the county reached a labor agreement with their labor union that they were having some sort of contract dispute over, and that's a good thing. You'll note it's accepting as a frame of reference that public labor unions and the ridiculous amount of pay and benefits that they extract from the taxpayer's expense are a good thing, which is very much in dispute. But that's how people operate in this world, right? They project their frame biases by establishing things that are not in dispute as though they were in things that are in dispute as though they were not in dispute, and thereby either stick it to the people who disagree or signal to the people who agree that they're on the same team. World stock markets rally, treasury yields fall on inflation data, and then you'll note here in Investors Business Daily, stock market ends week with a flourish, but note this flaw: inflation data lifts all boats. So, because money, well, okay. So, first of all, there's always this assumption that the behavior of the markets is explicable through some singularity, right? That there's a single good explanation for why the markets are acting like this, or at worst, a combination of a few different factors that come together, right? In the secondary instance, you'd say it's an absolute relativistic linkage with NI, or singularity, which says, okay, there's not a singular determinant factor here, but there are several main determinant factors, and these other things get lost in the wash, and so this is how we should approach it if we want to attain outcomes for ourselves financially, which are attained by predicting the behavior of this. That predicting the behavior of it is assuming that it's linked to things that you can identify, and that those things will in fact induce the outcomes that you predict. That is the case to some extent, but it's usually the case for particular companies more than it is for general trends, which is how people talk about it. But economics is an absolute mess, because economics is lacking a basic frame of reference which says this: what is wealth? Wealth is a metaphysical thing that is created called beholdens anytime somebody does useful work for another person, and currency is generated and pumped into the economy to represent that wealth. Since a great deal of new wealth is generated every year, because a lot of people do a lot of useful work for other people, the amount of currency pumped into the economy every year has to increase to keep up with that new wealth. And If they increase it too much, then you have inflation. If they don't increase it enough, then you have deflation. And it should also be noted that there are no non-fiat currencies. So the non-fiat currency is beholden to itself. That's to say, your ability to say to somebody, "Hey, you owe me one," regardless. SEC questions Elon Musk over late Twitter disclosure. So, what the world has done is they have TE'd a bunch of TI stuff. If you want to be a judge, for example, you have to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. Okay, so it's not enough that you're not allowing your interest to impact your decision making. I do have an interest in this matter. I am a stockholder in Meow Company, but I'm the judge, and I'm ruling on a case involving Meow Company. Well, yes, I'm a stockholder in Meow Company, but I'm not going to let that affect my judgment here. Is not okay. You have to avoid even the appearance of impropriety, okay? That's TEing TI. TI says you have to be objective, and TE says you can't be objective if you're interested. And TI goes, that's bullshit. I'm disinterested regardless. I'm not going to, if anything, I'm more likely to err against myself, because I am so intentionally opposed to bias. And TE says, well, the problem is other people aren't going to know whether you actually are or not. So, and FE goes, well, you got a point there. And so then you have what this rule called, avoiding even the appearance of impropriety. And for the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, when they're doing big intercompany deals like this, they like to get involved a lot and regulate a lot of stuff. And maybe or maybe not that's a good thing. I'm not making any statement about that. But in this instance, they have a lot of those kind of rules. You have to proactively provide things showing that you're not guilty. And that's not normally the case in the world, and it shouldn't be the case in the world, but it is and should be the case in certain instances. So, for example, with judges, I believe that is a correct rule to have, that judges need to avoid even the appearance of impropriety, because they're not merely being disinterested calculators, they're also being representatives of the public. And they need to show their respect for their duty as such by acting like it, So anyway, you can see you could go with this forever. Now, you might go, well, where's the originality one? Well, Microsoft confirms it's taking a new approach with its game streaming device. Back to the drawing board. Because now it's high ceiling again. Who knows what it's going to be? Whereas before their thing was failing, I guess. I don't know. It's hard to believe Google Drive is just now getting copy-paste shortcuts. Google Drive is... There's a method to their madness. Google really knows what they're doing. I'll tell you that. They really know what they're doing. They limit your ability to do certain things, but for reasons. It's like... It turns out maybe you don't really want that ability. And or... If you had that ability, there'd be this other problem that shows up, I have faith in Google. What is that? That's familiarity. That's SIFI. I like the way that Google has been predictably satisfying for me, and as a consequence, I feel positive feelings towards it. What about this? Top Gun Maverick. The ludicrous beauty of Top Gun Maverick. So, who would have thought? Because look, when I was a teenager, Tom Cruise was in Top Gun. Like 1980, whatever. Now, here's the crazy thing. It is now 2022, and he's in Top Gun again. Now, here's the thing. The next movie I want to see come out is Business is Still Risky. That's its working title. We can work on the title. Risky Business, The Golden Years. Unbelievable. Well, it's like what I was saying about the plays too, right? When I was in high school, what did they put on in the plays? They put on Annie, and they put on Grease. What plays do high schools put on today? Some 30 some years later. Annie and Grease still. Isn't that trippy? Why haven't they come out with new plays or something? Well, because people aren't that into plays anymore. Probably they're also a little too saucy nowadays. You gotta have something pretty milquetoast to pass muster for the high school. Although high schools are getting a little more, it's fine to be saucy as long as it's woke saucy, right? All right. Anyway, you get the gist of this. I could do this with I could do this with anything in the world. With anything in the world, you can tell a lot about. Remember, we're really talking about the people who wrote those articles. We're not talking about the articles themselves, because that's what we forget about when we do these things as objects of analysis. I may be analyzing the title. What I'm really doing is analyzing the person who wrote the title.